Lavish roses line the aisle of the Hawthorne private estate, their petals like drops of scarlet blood on white marble. The kind of wedding others dreamed of, photographed from magazines, envied from afar. But for Alara Grayson, standing in the middle of that opulence in a handmade satin dress and barely their heels, the only thing she saw was Damien's eyes. Calm, serious, unblinking. She loved him. That's why she was there. Not for the ring, not for the surname, not for the hundreds of high society guests pretending they cared. Just him. She had known Damien Hawthorne for 2 years. They met during a conference about corporate digital ethics, Alara as a rising tech specialist, Damien as the cold but charismatic heir of Hawthorne Industries. He had asked smart questions. She had challenged his assumptions. Their connection was strange at first, intense, driven by mutual respect, not chemistry. But chemistry came later. He had made her feel like she mattered, even when his world was far louder than hers. Now, as she stepped into that world fully, the edges of it already felt sharp. The estate was vast and cold, walls lined with abstract art and portraits of Hawthorne's long dead. Staff bowed without looking. The butler never addressed her directly. Vivian Hawthorne, Damien's mother, had greeted her with a nod and an icy smile. "You look different," she had said, as though she meant it as a compliment. But her eyes trailed down Alara's simple dress, her modest necklace, the way she wore her curls naturally instead of tied in diamonds like Vivian's own. The reception blurred. Champagne clinks, polished speeches, string quartets. Alara kept her smile steady, though her palms were cold. Every time she looked at Damien, he offered her a reassuring glance, but something about it felt detached. He wasn't unkind, but distracted. Or was it just the pressure of the night? Maybe it was her. Maybe she didn't belong in this world. Still, she held on to the vows he whispered to her earlier at the altar. "Whatever comes, I choose you." Later that night, while guests danced and the stars blinked above the glass rooftop ballroom, Alara wandered the corridors of the mansion. She stopped outside the study and overheard voices, Vivienne's, clipped and quiet. "The prenup is signed, isn't it?" A male voice answered. "Damien's." "It is." She didn't ask. A pause, a glass clink. "She won't. She's too in love." Alara stood frozen, her heart pressing against her chest so hard it hurt. She backed away before she could hear more, swallowing the sting in her throat. She hadn't thought to ask about a prenup. Why would she? She trusted Damien. She didn't come for his money. She had her own small startup, her own career, her own pride. But the fact that he had planned it quietly without ever telling her, what did that mean? She returned to the party with her face unchanged, her smile rehearsed. When Damien joined her minutes later, wrapping an arm around her waist, she didn't flinch. She leaned into him like nothing had cracked inside her. After all, they were still newlyweds. This was supposed to be the beginning of everything. But in the grand mirror that hung over the ballroom floor, Alara caught a glimpse of herself standing beside Damien. She looked beautiful, yes, but she also looked out of place, like a reflection misaligned with its source. And she knew, with the first real certainty of the evening, that love was not always enough, especially not in a world like this. Still, she stayed. She would stay because she believed in him, because she wanted to build something real, even if the vows were made of glass, even if one day they shattered. The first few months after the wedding were quiet, uneventful. Damien was always working, and Alara busied herself building a consulting firm from home. She tried to stay optimistic, telling herself that his long hours were necessary, that his silence was just exhaustion. But slowly, the silence turned into distance. It wasn't just physical, it was in his eyes, in the way he barely asked about her day, in the way he never mentioned her name at board meetings. The Damien she once debated with in late-night cafes no longer existed in this house of marble and glass. Vivian visited often now. She would sit in the sunroom, sipping green tea and watching Alara with that same cold scrutiny. "You know, dear," she said one afternoon, adjusting her designer scarf, When you're married to a man like Damien, you must know your place. Support from the sidelines, quiet elegance. That's the strength of a Hawthorne wife. Alara said nothing, but her chest burned. She tried to attend meetings. Hawthorne Industries was expanding into AI-driven platforms, something she had studied extensively, but every time she arrived, she was met with blank stares. Damien would smile politely and say, "This isn't the right forum for you, Alara." After the third attempt, she stopped going. One evening, she came home early from her co-working space and found Damien in the study, the door slightly ajar. He was speaking on a video call with board members, and her name came up. Of course, she's not involved in operations, but her signature helped finalize the merger with the Grayson patents. That was always part of the asset leverage strategy. Her blood went cold. She waited until the call ended, then stepped inside. "What merger?" she asked quietly. Damien looked up, caught off guard. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "Don't lie to me." He sighed and stood, running a hand through his hair. It was a legal formality. When your father passed, the estate left certain rights unclear. We just clarified ownership. Without telling me? You weren't ready, Alara. I wasn't ready? Or I wasn't supposed to know? He didn't answer. He walked past her without another word, leaving her standing in the center of the study, her heart pounding. That night, after he fell asleep, she went back to the study. She unlocked his desk drawer with a pin, something Zara had taught her years ago. Inside, she found a folder marked Merger Documents, Grayson Files. She flipped through them with shaking hands. There, printed in black and white, were pages and pages of legal transfers. Her name was listed as one of the primary signatories. Her signature appeared at the bottom of several forms, only she had never signed them. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from anger, but betrayal so deep it made her chest ache. This wasn't about business. This was about trust, about the man she married using her grief, her love, and her name to get what he wanted. For a moment, she sat still, staring at her forged name on those pages. A part of her wanted to confront him, scream, break something. But another part, the quieter, colder part that was slowly waking up inside her, knew this wasn't the time to fight. Not yet. She photocopied the files quietly and emailed them to herself under a disguised address. Then she closed the drawer, smoothed her hair, and returned to bed. Damien didn't even stir when she laid beside him. The next morning, she made him coffee like usual. He kissed her cheek without looking into her eyes, and she smiled, calm and patient. Love had brought her into this house, but it wouldn't protect her here. Not anymore. Not in a world where signatures could be stolen and vows used like pawns on a chessboard. Love was not a shield. It was a door. And behind that door, she had been ambushed. But the game had just begun. The morning of their second wedding anniversary was colder than usual. The sky was overcast, the city below dim beneath layers of fog, and even the usually vibrant garden behind the estate looked faded. Alara had planned a simple dinner. Nothing extravagant, just the two of them like it used to be. She wore a soft emerald dress Damien once said brought out her eyes. She lit candles, she cooked, she waited. But Damien didn't show. After 2 hours of unanswered texts and one ignored call, she changed into a coat and drove to the Hawthorne corporate tower. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he got stuck in another late meeting. She wanted to believe the best of him, again. But deep down, something inside her already knew. At the top floor, security hesitated to let her through, but she walked past them with the quiet authority she'd learned to wear. The boardroom's glass walls were soundproof, but the blinds were open. And there they were, Damien at the head of the table, Vivian beside him, and at least a dozen board members seated in a semicircle, watching him present. Alara stood just outside the door, heart pounding, as Damien clicked through a slide presentation. His voice, though muffled, was clear enough through the partial crack in the door. Thanks to the strategic merger and the Grayson IP rights, we've secured majority stakes in 3 of the sector's top platforms. A board member asked something. Damien responded with a smirk. Yes, Alara was the perfect stepping stone. The Grayson name opened doors, but she was never part of the core vision. She doesn't have the instinct for this kind of power. Laughter, nods, Vivian's satisfied smile. Alara stood frozen. She couldn't breathe. It was as if the air had been pulled out of the hallway. Her hand went to the doorknob, trembling. But she didn't enter. She didn't scream or cry. She simply turned and walked away. Back at the estate, she sat alone at the table she had decorated with candles, flowers, and the anniversary card she had written that morning. She read it again, silently, then tore it in half. That night, Vivian summoned her to the parlor. Damien wasn't home. The matriarch sat elegantly, wineglass in hand, her voice smooth and cold. "Alara," she began, "I think it's time we consider a dignified conclusion to this arrangement, for everyone's sake." Alara said nothing. "You'll be well taken care of," Vivian continued. "If you agree to an amicable divorce, we can avoid the press, the scandal. There's no need to drag this through the mud. You're still young. You'll land on your feet." Alara looked at her with hollow eyes. "You forged my signature," Vivian blinked. Then she smiled thinly. "You were family. We did what was necessary to preserve the legacy." Alara stood up slowly. "I was never family to you." She packed that night. No one stopped her, not the butler, not the housekeeper, not Damien, who never returned. She left with only 2 suitcases and her laptop. No settlement, no farewell, no apology, just silence. The next morning, a headline ran in the business column, "Hawthorne Industries celebrates expansion milestone." No mention of her, no trace she was ever part of the story. Alara checked into a modest apartment in a quiet part of the city. She sat on the floor of the empty living room, surrounded by boxes, and let the weight of everything collapse around her. She didn't cry, not yet. Her heart was too numb. But beneath the numbness, something stirred. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet, icy resolve. She had given them love. They had used her for leverage. Now stripped of everything, she had only one thing left: clarity. The apartment was small, 2 rooms and a narrow balcony that overlooked a noisy street, but it was hers. For the first time in years, Alara breathed air that wasn't filtered by wealth, expectation, or control. She slept on a mattress on the floor for the first month, surrounded by unopened boxes and half-assembled furniture. There were nights she woke up crying without knowing why, but she always got up the next morning. Zara moved in with her temporarily. Her younger sister was a stark contrast, blunt, tattooed, fiercely protective. While Alara kept her emotions folded inside, Zara let hers burn on the surface. "You were married to a vulture," she said bluntly one night while assembling a cheap bookshelf. "Now you get to fly on your own." Alara smiled faintly, brushing away a tear she hadn't meant to show. With Zara's help, she began again. She filed paperwork for a new consulting agency under the name eGrace Solutions. No last names, no face on the website, just results. Within 6 weeks, she had her first client, then 5, then 10. Word traveled fast in the tech world when someone delivered without demanding the spotlight. It was during this quiet rebuild that she reconnected with Julian Cade, an old friend from her university days, now a legal consultant for mid-tier startups. He found her through a mutual contact and called her out of the blue. "Alara," he said when she answered, voice cautious. "It's good to hear your voice again. I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk." "I didn't think anyone from the past still would," she said, more honest than she expected. They met the next day at a modest rooftop cafe. Julian looked the same, quiet eyes, warm smile, always slightly formal, like a man who carried too many thoughts and not enough sleep. But there was something new in him now, a sadness maybe, or maybe he saw it in her and reflected it. "I followed your story," he admitted over coffee, "but you disappeared before I could reach out." "I needed to," she replied. "They turned my name into a footnote, so I erased it and started over." Julian nodded. "Good, because I don't think you're finished yet." Their conversations became weekly, sometimes about business, sometimes not. He offered legal advice when she needed it, and silence when she didn't. He never brought up the old days, how he once told her he loved her, just before she announced her engagement to Damien. She remembered, but he never used it against her. Weeks turned into months. Alara's firm grew quietly. She never advertised. She didn't need to. The right people found her. And with each client, each project, she felt her confidence return, not as someone's wife, but as a woman who built things that lasted. Then one morning, Zara burst into her office, phone in hand. "You need to see this," she said, throwing the screen in front of her. It was a press release. Hawthorne Industries announces bid to acquire Coralite Technologies, a company Alara had helped prototype back when she was still working in her father's shadow. Her ideas, her architecture, her signature in the early patents, and now they were trying to take it. Alara didn't flinch. She simply stood up, walked to the window, and stared out over the skyline. The sun was just rising, washing the buildings in gold. "I'm done hiding," she said softly. Julian arrived later that evening. She showed him the documents she still had, proof of her involvement in Coralite's foundation, design blueprints with timestamps, even voice memos. He reviewed them carefully, then looked up at her. "With this," he said, "you can challenge the acquisition, publicly. And if we play it right, you could reclaim more than that." Alara nodded. "I don't just want to stop them. I want to show them who I am now, what they threw away." She no longer trembled when she said Damien's name. She no longer checked her reflection to see if she looked acceptable enough for the world he left her for. In the quiet fire of her rebirth, Alara Gray was no longer running. She was walking toward the storm, on her terms. The office lights stayed on well past midnight most nights now. Alara's modest workspace, once quiet and clean, had transformed into a war room. Folders lined the walls, whiteboards scribbled with timelines and corporate structures, and the sound of keyboard clicks echoed deep into the night. Julian often stayed beside her, sorting through legal documents, building the case piece by piece. They didn't go in guns blazing. Alara was methodical, calm. She didn't want revenge. She wanted precision. Every signature, every discrepancy, every financial trail had to be irrefutable. If she moved too soon, the Hawthorns would bury her again. But if she was thorough, she wouldn't just expose their manipulation. She would destroy the illusion of power they built by using people like her. Julian pulled records through corporate archives, some dating back years. Hidden shell companies, transaction logs, offshore accounts tied to names that linked back always to Vivienne or her proxies. One day he set down a file and simply said, "They've been laundering through fake consultancy firms since 2014. Alara read it in silence, and Damien signed off on all of it. There was no question now. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft disguised as strategy. And it hadn't stopped with her. So she reached out, quietly, to people she remembered from board meetings, names she had only heard in passing, faces she had once nodded to in hallways. Some ignored her. Some were loyal to Vivienne, but a few listened. And those few were enough. Alara met them in private rooms, in cafes far from downtown, in quiet parks under falling autumn leaves. They came in coats and sunglasses, looking over their shoulders, unsure if they should trust her. But she spoke with clarity and, most importantly, with facts. "You were forced to resign after that merger." "Do you know why?" she said to one. "The audit that cost your seat, it wasn't real," she told another. She didn't beg for their help. She handed them the truth and let it speak for itself. One by one, they came around. Not because they wanted to save her, but because they saw what she was building. A case, a movement, a reckoning. Meanwhile, the press began to buzz, quietly at first. Industry rumors about the return of a mysterious tech advisor connected to the Grayson legacy. Alara never stepped in front of a camera, but her firm began submitting critical reports under her alias, subtly undermining Hawthorne Industries' credibility in upcoming acquisitions. Vivienne noticed. One afternoon, Alara received a courier envelope with no return address. Inside, a single note. "Stop digging. You know how this ends." She read it twice, then slid it into a drawer. She didn't tell Julian, not yet. She didn't need to. Because by then, she had already contacted 3 national watchdog groups, submitted early reports of corporate fraud, and leaked just enough to make the board members question Vivian's control. And the most devastating evidence was still waiting. In one old USB archive, Julian recovered from a former compliance officer, they found the original digital contracts from the Grayson merger, complete with metadata showing the signature insertions. Damien had uploaded them. Vivian had approved. The evidence was clear. Alara had never signed those forms. Her name had been used without consent to steal the rights to her father's company. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. She stared at the screen for a long time after they opened the file. Not in shock. She had long passed that stage, but with quiet certainty. "They made me into a transaction," she whispered. Julian leaned forward, voice low. "And now?" She looked at him, eyes burning. Not with tears, but with fire. "Now I become the consequence." In the weeks that followed, Alara's team expanded. Her small firm became a shadow force. Analysts, researchers, tech security specialists, and lawyers connected only by encrypted links and silent trust. She didn't want fame. She wanted control. And for the first time, she had it. Behind her name, a storm gathered. Not of rage, but of justice sharpened with facts and fueled by purpose. The Hawthorns didn't see it yet, but they would, soon. The gala was held at the Grand Orpheus Hotel, a place of glass chandeliers and echoing marble, where fortunes were toasted and reputations sculpted. For years, Alara had entered rooms like this as a guest, unacknowledged, underdressed, invisible behind Damien's shadow. Tonight, she wasn't a shadow. She was the storm. She arrived just as the last light of dusk bled into the skyline. The valet opened her car door to reveal a woman transformed, Alara in a sleek, minimalist black gown, her curls swept back, a single diamond at her throat. No excess, no noise, just elegance sharpened like a blade. Flashes from cameras began the moment her heels touched the red carpet. No one recognized her at first, but the name whispered across the press line spread like a dropped match in dry grass. "Alara, is that? She's here? I thought she vanished." She didn't answer any questions. She simply walked forward, flanked by Julian on one side and a quiet associate on the other. Inside the ballroom, the music paused momentarily as conversations dimmed. She made her way through the crowd toward the main floor, where members of Hawthorne Industries were already seated. Damien in tailored gray, Vivian in pearl white, surrounded by investors and board allies. Damien saw her first. His body tensed, glass frozen in midair. Vivian turned slowly, her practiced smile faltering. "Alara?" Damien's voice was low, barely a breath. She didn't stop walking. The event was meant to celebrate Hawthorne Industries' expansion into next-generation cybersecurity, a project Alara had, ironically, once helped conceptualize. The keynote speaker was midway through his carefully rehearsed praise when the room's attention shifted fully to her. She didn't wait for an introduction. She stepped to the side of the stage, where the host hesitated, unsure whether to stop her. She leaned toward the microphone, voice calm, even. "Forgive the interruption. I'm Alara Grayson, or as some of you may recall, the former Mrs. Hawthorne." Gasps rippled across the audience. The MC stepped back. No one interrupted her. "I'm not here to reminisce. I'm here because tonight's celebration is built in part on stolen foundations. My family's technology, my late father's patents, and my name, which was used without consent to secure critical merger documents." She paused. "Tonight, I'm here to take back what was mine." A buzz of murmurs erupted through the crowd. Damien rose from his seat, but Alara raised her hand. "I won't be silenced this time." From her associate's case, she pulled a sleek tablet and tapped it. The giant screen behind the stage flickered, then displayed documents, timestamped contracts, metadata, and her forensic evidence showing signature forgeries. My legal team has submitted these findings to the appropriate authorities. But more than that, I'm announcing that through a series of independent acquisitions, I've secured a 23% stake in Hawthorne Industries' AI division, effective immediately. A stunned silence. She turned slowly toward Damien and Vivian, who now sat stiff and stone-faced. You used me to gain control of my family's legacy. Tonight, I use my knowledge to expose how little control you really have. Julian stepped forward and handed printed summaries to attending press. The journalists, once unsure of her presence, now leaned forward with recorders, pens scribbling furiously. The tide had turned. Vivian tried to stand, voice tight. "This is an ambush." "No," Alara replied coolly. "This is accountability." A few of the board members nodded in subtle recognition. She had already spoken to them privately days before. Alleys planted, trust rebuilt, silence broken. Alara didn't wait for applause. She left the stage with grace, her job done. Behind her, the air buzzed with chaos, phones ringing, reporters cornering executives, whispers becoming storms. As she walked out through the glowing doors of the gala, she didn't look back. The ghost wife had returned, not to haunt them, but to bury the lies. And this time, she walked into the night not as someone they forgot, but as someone they would never be able to erase again. The fallout was immediate. By the following morning, every major business outlet had Alara's name on its front page. The ghost wife who took back the crown, Alara Grayson strikes Hawthorne Industries from the shadows, and secrets, signatures, and a storm in the boardroom were just a few of the headlines flooding news feeds. Within 48 hours, the shareholders called for an emergency board session, and Alara was invited, not as a guest, not as a former spouse, but as a stakeholder. The meeting was tense. Vivian arrived first, immaculately dressed in her trademark white blazer, lips drawn in a sharp line. She greeted no one. Damien followed, a step behind, clearly shaken but pretending otherwise. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. The rest of the board filled the long glass room slowly, whispering, cautious, calculating. The weight of exposure had unsettled even the most loyal. Alara entered last with Julian at her side and a briefcase in hand. She no longer wore the subtle discomfort of someone trying to fit in. She was composed, sharp, and unapologetically present. When she took her seat near the center of the table, no one objected. Vivian spoke first, her voice calm but brittle. "This circus has gone far enough. The allegations made by Miss Grayson are both misleading and damaging to this institution's integrity. We cannot allow personal vendettas to disrupt decades of legacy." Julian opened his case and placed several documents on the table. "With all due respect, Mrs. Hawthorne, these aren't allegations. These are authenticated records, digitally verified, legally confirmed, and every one of them traces back to a deliberate abuse of trust within this board." He passed around copies of contracts, bank transfers, internal emails, each linking Damien to illegal insider dealings and Vivian to the approval of fraudulent documents. Damien's voice finally broke the silence. "You don't understand how this works. This is how things are done at this level." "No," Alara cut in sharply. "This is how you did it. You used my name, my trust, and my grief after my father's death to access what didn't belong to you, and then you buried me under a pile of silence." She turned toward the others at the table. "But I'm not here to destroy Hawthorne Industries. I'm here to rebuild it from the pieces you tried to steal." There was a long silence before one of the elder board members, a man named Crosswell who had served since Damien's father's era, cleared his throat. "Miss Grayson, what do you propose?" Julian handed him a second file. "Restructuring. Effective immediately. Damien Hawthorne is to be suspended pending legal review. Vivian Hawthorne will step down from all active roles within the company. An independent oversight committee will be formed, and Miss Grayson will temporarily assume a strategic director role to stabilize the transition." Vivian stood, slamming her palm on the table. "This is a coup." "No," Alara said, eyes locked on hers. "This is your mirror." The room remained still. Then slowly, heads began to nod. One by one, votes were cast. The motion passed. Damien was silent as the security escort arrived to collect his badge. Vivienne didn't speak again. She turned away, her face unreadable, and walked out without another word. It was the first time Alara had seen her look small. Outside the building, the media swarmed. Julian shielded Alara as reporters shoved microphones forward, begging for a quote. She paused, turned to face them, and said clearly, "This isn't about revenge, it's about truth. Power without integrity is nothing. And I think it's time we remember that." The crowd erupted in questions, but she didn't linger. She walked to the car, opened the door herself, and slid into the passenger seat. Julian started the engine. "You were incredible in there," he said quietly. Alara didn't smile, but there was a strange peace in her eyes. "The mask is off," she murmured. "Now the real work begins." For the first time in years, she felt the weight lift, not all at once, but enough to breathe. They had tried to erase her. Instead, she'd carved her name into the foundation they once controlled. And now, she would rebuild it, stronger, cleaner, and untouchable. The courtroom buzzed with tension on the first day of the trial. Journalists lined the hallway, photographers jostling for position, their flashes reflecting off the polished floors. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Every seat filled, every glance fixed on the two people seated at opposite ends of the aisle. Alara Grayson and Damien Hawthorne, once husband and wife, now stood as adversaries in a public war, no longer confined to boardrooms and whispers. Alara entered with quiet confidence. Dressed in a tailored navy suit and her signature calm expression, she carried nothing but a thin folder and a steady heart. Her legal team followed close behind, led by Julian Cade, who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. On the other side, Damien sat rigid in a dark charcoal suit, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable, but the exhaustion in his eyes was clear. His defense team looked defensive before the proceedings even began. Alara had filed a civil suit against Damien for asset theft, identity fraud, and the illegal use of her name and intellectual property in the Grayson-Hawthorne merger. Her case was meticulously detailed. Every signature had been authenticated and then invalidated by digital forensics. Every contract traced back to an altered origin. And every witness, some reluctant, some eager, corroborated the timeline. But Damien, backed into a corner, fought back in desperation. He filed a countersuit, accusing Alara of slander, breach of marital confidentiality, and attempting to intentionally sabotage Hawthorne Industries for personal gain. It was a weak play, built more on narrative than proof, but it made headlines. The trial became more than a case. It became a public spectacle. Day after day, clips of Alara's testimony appeared on every business channel. Public opinion was divided at first. Some painted her as a woman scorned, others hailed her as a symbol of courage in the face of systemic betrayal. But Alara never wavered. In the witness stand, when asked why she had waited so long to come forward, she answered plainly, "Because I believed in love longer than I should have. Because I was taught to endure before I was taught to fight. But I'm here now." Damien's turn on the stand was less composed. When pressed about the forged documents, he deflected. When asked about using Alara's name without her consent, he stumbled. And when the prosecution revealed internal emails between him and Vivienne, planning the entire manipulation before the wedding had even taken place, his silence was louder than denial. During closing arguments, Julian addressed the courtroom calmly. "This is not just a matter of wealth or reputation. It's about consent. It's about using someone's trust as a currency. Miss Grayson lost her family, her legacy, and her name in one move, but she didn't lose her dignity, and now she asks only for what is rightfully hers." Then Alara stood to speak briefly before the court, her voice clear, steady. "You took everything I had, but forgot I still had myself. You thought I would disappear quietly, that I would accept the story you wrote for me. But I'm not a footnote in your empire. I'm the part you can't delete anymore." The courtroom sat in still silence as she returned to her seat. The judge recessed for deliberation. Outside, the media swarmed with renewed fire. Hashtags trended worldwide. Influencers, scholars, business leaders, everyone was watching. The trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become a message. When the verdict was delivered 2 days later, the room was breathless. The court found Damien Hawthorne liable for asset misappropriation and identity fraud. All shares acquired under Alara's name would be returned. Damien was ordered to pay damages, and his remaining position within Hawthorne Industries was permanently revoked. As the judge concluded the statement, Damien sat frozen. His attorneys whispered options, but he didn't move. He had lost not just the case, but the illusion of control. Alara closed her folder, stood, and gave him a final glance, not with hatred, but with quiet clarity. Not victory, but closure. Outside the courthouse, journalists pressed forward. One asked, "Miss Grayson, do you have anything to say now that it's over?" She paused, looked directly into the lens, and said, "It was never about revenge. It was about not disappearing." Then she stepped into the sunlight, no longer fighting for her place, because she had already claimed it. The final ruling echoed across the business world like a shockwave. By the end of the week, the headlines had shifted from speculation to certainty. Alara Grayson reclaims Grayson legacy, Hawthorne Empire restructured after court defeat, and most poignantly, the wife they tried to erase is now their overseer. The first thing Alara did was walk through the old Grayson Tech campus, once a proud but now neglected site that her father had built with dreams of ethical innovation. After his death, it had been quietly absorbed into Hawthorne Industries, reduced to a storage unit for patents and shelved ideas. But now, it was hers again. She stood in the center of the dusty atrium, sunlight pouring through broken glass panels, and whispered, "We're coming back to life, Dad." With full ownership restored, Alara moved fast. The Grayson name returned not as a relic, but as a reborn venture. She appointed a new CEO, an old mentor of her father's, revived shelved projects, and launched the G Initiative, a program designed to fund ethical tech startups led by young women and marginalized innovators. It wasn't just business anymore, it was purpose. Meanwhile, the board of Hawthorne Industries executed the emergency measures that had been quietly prepared. Damien was officially ousted. His shares were frozen pending restitution payments, and he was barred from holding executive roles in any affiliated companies for the next decade. Rumors swirled that he had left the country for a sabbatical, but Alara didn't care where he went. He was no longer her concern. Vivienne, on the other hand, put up a fight. For days after the verdict, she had insisted on remaining in her ceremonial role as founder emeritus. She argued legacy, tradition, dignity. But the board had already made up its mind. The damage was too deep, the documents too damning. In a final board vote, 9-1, she was asked to resign. The next morning, Vivienne held a private press conference. Her statement was bitter but short. "I leave this position with pride in what I built. I will not speak further." She exited the building without applause, without tears, without anyone waiting to walk her out. Alara, meanwhile, was quietly appointed to a new leadership framework, an external ethics chair for Hawthorne Industries. She wouldn't control the company, but she would have veto power on mergers, technology use, and board hiring. She was the conscience of the company now. The very thing they once tried to remove had become their guidepost. Her office was smaller than Vivienne's had been. She chose it that way. No views, no antiques, just a clean desk, white walls, and a single framed photo of her and her father laughing at a science fair 20 years ago. Julian visited on her first official day. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes full of quiet pride. "So," he said, "you've got everything back." "Not everything," she replied, "but the parts that matter." He smiled. "And now?" "Now," she said, "we make sure it never happens to another woman again." In the following weeks, she launched internal policy reforms, mandatory ethics training, and transparent hiring audits across Hawthorne's branches. Some resisted, of course, but the tides were shifting. Not because she demanded loyalty, but because she led by example, and the world watched. The media no longer called her the ex-wife of Damien Hawthorne. She was now simply Alara Grayson, founder, reformer, survivor. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, not the Hawthorne estate, not a hotel suite, just her home. She touched the edge of her reflection, no longer searching for cracks in the glass. Her name had been dragged, stolen, manipulated, then erased. But she had written it back, boldly, deliberately, not in vengeance, but in truth, and it would never be removed again. The river outside Alara's new office moved slowly, like time after a long storm. The building itself was nothing grand, an old brick structure with ivy crawling up its sides and wide windows that opened to the water. It had once been a warehouse, now converted into a co-working hub filled with startups and independent creators. Alara's corner space sat on the third floor, quiet and uncluttered. No plaques, no receptionists, just a desk, a laptop, and shelves full of journals and books marked with her father's handwriting. She no longer needed a spotlight. Her work spoke for itself. After the courtroom victories and media chaos faded, Alara declined every offer to write a memoir, host a talk show, or sell her story to streaming networks. She had lived it, not for profit, not for performance, and now that her name had been reclaimed, she chose not to spend the rest of her life chasing headlines. Instead, she built something quieter and maybe more powerful. She launched the Grayson Initiative for Women, a mentorship program that connected young female entrepreneurs, coders, and innovators with experienced leaders in the tech and finance industries. It was grounded not in charity, but in investment, training them, funding their ideas, and protecting their equity so no one would ever be used the way she had been. Each week, she met with new mentees. Some were wide-eyed and shy. Others had already been bruised by systems they didn't understand. Alara listened to them all. She offered advice, yes, but more than that, she offered presence. Proof that survival was possible. That rebuilding didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering better. Julian still visited sometimes. They never defined what they were. He knew her rhythm, when she needed company and when she needed solitude. One evening, as they walked by the river, he asked, "Do you regret not pushing for more? Not finishing them off completely?" She looked ahead, then shook her head gently. "Revenge makes noise," she said. "But peace makes space. I needed space to breathe again." The tabloids eventually moved on. Damien disappeared from public life, his name slowly removed from the brands he once tried to control. Vivienne retired to Europe, her legacy left brittle and unspoken. Neither tried to contact her, and if they had, Alara wouldn't have answered. One afternoon, a journalist from a respected business journal requested a private interview, not a feature. Just one question for a quote to end their year's issue. What kept you going? The answer came to her without hesitation. She smiled faintly and said, "Love made me stay, but betrayal made me strong, and justice made me whole." That quote went viral in a quiet, lasting way, not loud like the scandal, but resonant. It was printed on mugs in women's networking groups, framed on startup office walls, repeated in graduation speeches. It wasn't the end of a war, it was the start of her peace. Alara sat by her window that evening, legs tucked beneath her, watching the sun settle against the water. The city behind her kept moving, its towers glowing, its pace relentless. But here, in this small office built from ruin and grace, she was still. Not victorious, not defeated, just whole. And that, in the end, was the greatest win of all.